Good evening, my dear friends. Come, settle in by the fire tonight, for I have a tale that still haunts my dreams. A story about obsession, about the dangerous line between collecting and coveting, and about a man who paid the ultimate price for his insatiable hunger for the forbidden. It was the autumn of 1971, and I was covering what seemed like a routine estate sale in the grand Blackwood Manor just outside of Salem, Massachusetts. The owner, Dr. Reginald Blackwood, had been a renowned antiquarian and collector of unusual items, Oriental artifacts, medieval manuscripts, ancient religious relics. His collection was legendary among those who dealt in the rare and mysterious. Dr. Blackwood had died under peculiar circumstances just 2 weeks prior. The housekeeper found him in his private study, seated at his mahogany desk, surrounded by his most prized possessions. But here's what troubled the authorities, and what drew me to the story. He had died with his eyes wide open, staring at something on his desk, and the expression frozen on his face was one of absolute, consuming terror. The coroner ruled it a heart attack brought on by shock, but couldn't explain what had frightened a man who had spent his entire life collecting objects that most people would find unsettling. Dr. Blackwood was known to own cursed artifacts, items with dark histories, pieces that other collectors wouldn't dare touch. The estate sale was being held to liquidate his collection. His only heir, a distant nephew in England, wanted nothing to do with what he called Uncle Reginald's macabre hobby. Until the entire collection would go to the highest bidders, and I was there to write about the dispersal of one of New England's most mysterious private collections. The auction house was Pemberton and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious establishments. The room was packed with collectors, dealers, and curiosity seekers from around the world. I recognized several faces: wealthy industrialists with a taste for the occult, museum curators looking for rare pieces, and a few individuals whose presence made me distinctly uncomfortable. The auctioneer, Mr. Pemberton himself, was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who had been conducting these sales for decades, but even he seemed unusually nervous that day. His hands trembled slightly as he consulted his notes, and I noticed him glancing repeatedly toward a particular section of items that had been cordoned off with red velvet ropes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pemberton began, his voice carrying across the room, "we begin today with Dr. Blackwood's collection of medieval manuscripts. Lot number 1, a 13th century illuminated book of hours, provenance unknown, acquired by Dr. Blackwood in 1952 from a monastery in the Pyrenees." The early lots went smoothly. A Byzantine icon sold for $12,000. A collection of Renaissance medical instruments fetched $8,000. A set of alchemical texts in Latin brought in $15,000 from a private collector who bid by telephone from Switzerland. But as the hours progressed and we moved through the collection, I began to notice a pattern. The more unusual items, those with darker histories or unexplained origins, seemed to create an atmosphere of unease in the room. Conversations would quiet when certain pieces were brought to the podium. Some bidders would examine an item closely, then suddenly withdraw their interest, as if something about the object had disturbed them. There was a 16th century confession chair from a Spanish monastery, where, according to the catalogue, 3 priests had died under mysterious circumstances. A Victorian mourning locket that allegedly drove its previous 7 owners to madness. A jade funeral mask from ancient China that was said to trap the souls of those who gazed upon it too long. Each of these items sold, but not without incident. The confession chair was purchased by a dealer from New York who insisted on having it blessed by a priest before transport. The mourning locket went to a collector who immediately wrapped it in black silk and wouldn't look directly at it again. The jade mask was bought by a museum curator who handled it only while wearing white cotton gloves and muttering what sounded like protective prayers. But it was lot 247 that changed everything. Pemberton's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he announced it. The Speculo Mortis, the Mirror of Death. Venetian origin, circa 1580. Provenance, uncertain. Acquired by Dr. Blackwood in 1967 from a private estate in Romania. The moment the mirror was wheeled onto the display platform, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. It was magnificent and terrifying at the same time. The frame was elaborate Baroque silver covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. But it was the mirror's surface that truly unnerved me. Instead of reflecting the auction room, the mirror seemed to absorb light. Looking into it was like staring into dark water at midnight. Occasionally, shadows would move across its surface, shadows that corresponded to nothing in the room. The mirror comes with an extensive history, Pemberton continued, consulting his notes with obvious reluctance. It was allegedly commissioned by Venetian nobleman Count Vitale Dandolo in 1580. The Count was known for his occult practices. According to the documentation, 17 people who owned this mirror over the centuries met violent or unexplained deaths. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the usual rustle of catalogue pages and quiet conversations had stopped. Everyone was staring at the mirror, and I swear I could feel it staring back. The mirror was lost for over a century before surfacing in a castle in Romania in 1943. The German officer who confiscated it during the war was found dead in his quarters 3 days later, apparently having clawed his own eyes out. After the war, it passed through several private collections. Each owner reported disturbing experiences. Pemberton set down his notes and looked out over the crowd. Dr. Blackwood's own notes on this piece are troubling. He wrote extensively about voices emanating from the mirror, about images appearing in its surface that showed events from the past and the future. His final entry, written just days before his death, simply reads, "It knows my name now. It calls to me every night. I should never have brought it into my home." The silence stretched on for nearly a full minute. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, $2,000. The bidder was a man I hadn't noticed before, pale, thin, dressed in an expensive black suit. His eyes were fixed on the mirror with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. There was something hungry in his gaze, something desperate. $2,000 from bidder 73, Pemberton acknowledged, though I noticed his voice cracked slightly. Do I hear 3,000? For a moment it seemed like no one else would bid. Then a woman near the front raised her paddle. 3,000. The pale man immediately counted 5,000, and so it began. What followed was the most intense bidding war I had ever witnessed. The price climbed rapidly. 7,000, 10,000, 15,000. But what disturbed me wasn't the escalating price. It was the behavior of the bidders. The pale man in the back had begun to sweat profusely, though the room wasn't particularly warm. His hands shook as he raised his paddle, and I could hear him muttering under his breath, words in a language I didn't recognize. The woman bidding against him seemed equally affected. Her face had grown ashen, and she clutched her catalogue so tightly that her knuckles were white. But neither would back down. At $25,000, the woman suddenly stood up and walked out of the room without a word, leaving her catalogue behind. I watched her go and noticed that her hands were trembling violently. 25,000 once, twice. Pemberton's gavel hovered in the air. The pale man was staring at the mirror with such intensity that I thought he might be in some kind of trance. Sold to bidder 73 for $25,000. After the auction concluded, I made it my business to learn more about bidder 73. His name was Marcus Aldrich, and he was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to be drawn to such a dark object. Aldrich came from old Boston money. His family had made their fortune in shipping during the 19th century, but Marcus had always been the black sheep. While his brothers went into respectable businesses, Marcus had developed an obsession with the occult from an early age. He had spent his family's money traveling the world, seeking out artifacts with dark histories. I managed to approach him as he was arranging transport for the mirror. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His skin had an almost translucent quality, as if he rarely saw sunlight. His eyes were deeply set and constantly moving, as if he were looking for something, or running from something. "Mr. Aldrich," I introduced myself, "I'm Edmund Thornfield from the Boston Herald. I'm writing about today's auction. That's quite a remarkable piece you've acquired." He turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes held an intensity that was almost predatory. "Remarkable," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you could say that, though I suspect you have no idea just how remarkable it truly is." "The mirror has quite a reputation," I ventured. 17 deaths, according to the documentation." Aldrich laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Documentation only tells part of the story, Mr. Thornfield. The real history of the Speculo Mortis is far more extensive. Those 17 deaths were merely the ones that were recorded. The mirror has been claiming souls for over 400 years. He leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of something strange, not cologne or aftershave, but something almost medicinal, like formaldehyde. "Dr. Blackwood made extensive notes about the mirror's properties. I've been corresponding with him for months, hoping he might be willing to sell. His death, while unfortunate, presented an opportunity I couldn't pass up." "What makes this particular mirror so special?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Aldrich's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. "It's not just a mirror, Mr. Thornfield. It's a window, a portal between our world and somewhere else. The Count who commissioned it was attempting to contact his deceased wife. The mirror was created using very specific materials: silver mined from cursed ground, glass made from sand collected from plague sites, frame carved from wood taken from gallows trees." He paused, studying my reaction. Dr. Blackwood documented several manifestations. Images appearing in the mirror that showed events from the past, voices speaking from within its depths. And toward the end of his notes, something even more remarkable: the mirror began showing him future events. Future events. "Deaths, Mr. Thornfield. The mirror shows how people will die." Dr. Blackwood's final entry described seeing his own death in the mirror's surface. 3 days later, he was found dead in his study, staring at the very spot where the mirror had been kept. Against my better judgment, I accepted Aldrich's invitation to visit his home the following week to see the mirror in its new setting. His mansion in Beacon Hill was a testament to his family's former wealth, but it had a distinctly oppressive atmosphere. The house was filled with his collection, artifacts from around the world, each with its own dark history. Egyptian canopic jars that allegedly still contained the preserved organs of cursed pharaohs, a medieval torture device from the Spanish Inquisition, a collection of voodoo dolls from Haiti, each one said to be bound to a specific person's soul. But it was clear that the mirror had become the centerpiece of his collection. He had installed it in what was once the mansion's grand ballroom, positioning it so that it dominated the entire space. Heavy velvet curtains framed it like a theatrical backdrop, and dozens of candles provided the only illumination. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" Aldrich whispered as we entered the room. He couldn't take his eyes off the mirror, and I noticed that his appearance had changed since the auction just a week ago. He looked thinner, more gaunt. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and his hands trembled with what seemed like barely contained excitement. "Have you experienced any of the phenomena Dr. Blackwood wrote about?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. Aldrich's laugh was bitter. "Oh, Mr. Thornfield, I've experienced far more than poor Dr. Blackwood ever did. He was afraid of the mirror, tried to resist its call, but I've embraced it. I've learned to communicate with it. He approached the mirror, and I noticed that his reflection seemed somehow different, darker, more distorted than it should have been. It's been showing me things, Mr. Thornfield. Wonderful, terrible things. The past, the present, the future. They're all the same to the mirror. Time is just another dimension for the entities that dwell beyond its surface. Entities? The mirror isn't just a portal, it's a prison. The Count who commissioned it didn't just want to contact his dead wife. He wanted to bring her back. The ritual he performed bound her soul to the mirror, along with the souls of everyone who has died while in its presence. They're all there, trapped behind the glass, waiting for someone like me to set them free. As he spoke, I could swear I saw movement in the mirror's depths, shadowy forms that seemed to reach toward us. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. "It's been teaching me," Aldrich continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic cadence. "The mirror has shown me rituals, incantations, methods of crossing between worlds. Dr. Blackwood saw it as a curse, but I see it as the greatest opportunity in human history." "No, what kind of opportunity?" Aldrich turned to face me fully, and I gasped. In the week since the auction, he had aged what looked like years. His skin was now almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes had sunk deeper into his skull, and when he smiled, I could see that several of his teeth had become loose. "The opportunity to transcend death itself, Mr. Thornfield. The mirror has promised me immortality, not just of the soul, but of consciousness itself. All I have to do is complete the ritual that Count Dandolo began 400 years ago." Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn back to Aldrich's mansion with increasing frequency. What had started as professional curiosity had become something closer to obsession. There was a story unfolding here, a story that went far beyond a simple auction piece. Each visit revealed new developments. Aldrich's physical deterioration was accelerating at an alarming rate. By the third week, he could barely maintain the pretense of normal human interaction. He would spend hours standing before the mirror, carrying on conversations with entities that only he could see. But more disturbing were the changes in the mirror itself. What had once been a simply ominous reflective surface was becoming increasingly active. During my visits, I witnessed phenomena that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. The first manifestation I experienced personally occurred during my fourth visit. Aldrich was showing me some new acquisitions when we heard voices coming from the ballroom. Multiple voices, speaking in different languages, all emanating from the direction of the mirror. We rushed to the ballroom to find the mirror's surface writhing with activity. Faces were appearing and disappearing in its depths, faces of people from different eras, all wearing expressions of agony or terror. Some I recognized from historical paintings. Others were completely unknown, but all shared the same haunted, desperate look. "They're awakening," Aldrich whispered, his voice filled with reverent awe. "The ritual is beginning to work. The barrier between worlds is weakening." As we watched, one face became clearer than the others. A woman in Renaissance dress, her hair elaborately styled in the fashion of 16th century Venice. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, though no sound reached us. "That's her," Aldrich breathed. "Contessa Elena Dandolo, the Count's wife. She's trying to tell me something." But as I looked closer at the woman's face, I didn't see someone trying to communicate. I saw someone screaming, someone trapped and desperate to escape. The expression in her eyes wasn't love or longing, but pure, undiluted terror. Over the next hour, more faces appeared. Some were clearly from different time periods. I saw what looked like a German officer from World War II, several people in Victorian dress, and others in clothing I couldn't identify. But they all shared that same expression of trapped desperation. "Don't you see, Mr. Thornfield?" Aldrich asked, his eyes shining with fanatic fervour. "They're not trapped. They're gathered. The mirror is collecting them, preparing for the grand reunion. Soon, the barrier will fall completely, and we'll all be together on the other side." "What about the living world?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Aldrich's smile was chilling. "What about it? Death is just another state of being. The mirror has shown me what lies beyond, a realm where consciousness exists without the limitations of flesh, where knowledge and power are absolute. Why would anyone choose to remain trapped in these decaying bodies when such transcendence is possible?" By November, Aldrich's transformation was nearly complete. When I arrived for what would be my final visit, I barely recognized him. His skin had become almost paper-thin, and dark veins were clearly visible beneath the surface. His eyes had sunk so deeply into his skull that they seemed to peer out from caverns, but it was his behavior that had changed most dramatically. He moved with a strange, jerky gait, as if he were no longer entirely in control of his own body. His voice had taken on an odd resonance, as if multiple people were speaking through him at once, and he had begun referring to himself in the plural. "We think, we have decided, we are ready." The ballroom had been transformed into something resembling a medieval ritual chamber. Chalk symbols covered every inch of the floor. Complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. Dozens of black candles provided the only light, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the entire room feel alive and threatening. Ancient books lay open on wooden pedestals arranged around the mirror. I recognized some of the texts, forbidden grimoires that I had heard whispered about in academic circles but never seen in person. The Necronomicon, the Lemegeton, the Sworn Book of Honorius, texts that most scholars believed were myths or medieval hoaxes. "Tonight is the night, Mr. Thornfield," Aldrich announced as I entered the ballroom. "The stars are properly aligned, the mirror has reached the necessary level of spiritual saturation, and I have finally mastered the incantations. Tonight, the barrier falls permanently." "What exactly are you planning to do?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. "The same ritual Count Dandolo attempted 4 centuries ago, but with one crucial difference. He was trying to bring his wife back to our world. I'm going to join her in hers, and once the barrier is broken from both sides simultaneously, it will never be able to reform. The 2 worlds will merge, and death will become meaningless." As he spoke, the mirror began to glow with an otherworldly light. The faces trapped within became more distinct, and I could see them pressing their hands against the glass as if trying to break through. But what terrified me most was the realization that they weren't trying to escape into our world. They were trying to warn us about something in theirs. "Aldrich," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "look at their faces. Really look at them. Do they seem happy to be there? Do they seem like they want company?" For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but then his expression hardened with fanatic resolve. "They're afraid because they've been alone for so long. Once we join them, once the worlds merge, they'll understand. We'll all understand." He began the ritual at precisely midnight. The incantations were in Latin, but it was Latin unlike anything I'd ever heard. The words seemed to twist and writhe as he spoke them, taking on lives of their own. The candle flames began to flicker wildly, though there was no wind in the room. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water. The faces within became clearer and more numerous. I could see dozens of them now, all pressing against the barrier, all trying desperately to communicate something. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room plummeted. Ice began to form on the windows, and I could see my breath in thick clouds, but Aldrich seemed unaffected by the cold. If anything, he appeared to be drawing energy from it. The mirror's glow intensified until it was almost blinding. The faces within were no longer just faces. I could see entire figures reaching out toward us with desperate urgency. And then I heard them. Whispers at first, then voices, then screams. All of them saying the same thing. Don't let him finish. Don't let him open the way. The voices from the mirror weren't speaking in welcome. They were screaming in warning. As Aldrich reached the climax of his incantation, I finally understood what the trapped souls had been trying to tell us. They weren't the only inhabitants of the mirror's realm. Something else lived there, something that fed on human consciousness, that had been using the mirror as a trap for centuries. The Count, his wife, Dr. Blackwood, all the others. They hadn't achieved transcendence. They had become food. "Aldrich, stop!" I shouted over the growing supernatural storm. "They're trying to warn us. There's something else in there." But he was beyond hearing. His eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and the voice speaking through him was no longer his own. It was deeper, older, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The mirror's surface bulged outward, as if something enormous were pressing against it from the other side. Cracks began to appear in the glass, spreading like spiderwebs across its surface. Through the gaps, I could see glimpses of what lay beyond, not the realm of transcendent consciousness that Aldrich had imagined, but something far more terrible. It was a place of eternal hunger, where consciousness existed only to suffer, where the entity that ruled there fed on souls like a spider feeding on trapped flies. The faces I had seen weren't trying to escape. They were trying to prevent others from joining them in their eternal torment. The mirror exploded outward in a shower of glass and otherworldly light. I threw myself behind one of the wooden pedestals as fragments whistled through the air. When I looked up, Aldrich was gone, not dead, not disappeared, but somehow absorbed into the swirling vortex of darkness that had emerged from the mirror's remains. For a moment that felt like eternity, I stared into that vortex and saw the truth. I saw Aldrich, conscious but powerless, being consumed by something that existed beyond human comprehension. I saw the Count and his wife, Dr. Blackwood and dozens of others, all trapped in a web of living shadow that fed on their terror and despair. And I saw the entity itself, ancient beyond measure, patient beyond understanding, always hungry for more souls to add to its collection. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The vortex collapsed, the supernatural light faded, and I found myself alone in a room filled with nothing but broken glass and the lingering scent of something that reminded me of ancient graveyards. I fled that house and never returned. The authorities found Aldrich's body 3 days later, seated in the remains of the ballroom, surrounded by fragments of the mirror. Like Dr. Blackwood before him, he had died with his eyes wide open and an expression of absolute terror on his face. I never wrote the story I had originally planned. How could I? Who would have believed such an account? Instead, I filed a brief piece about the auction and let the matter rest. But the mirror's influence didn't end with Aldrich's death. Over the years, I tracked down several of the other items from Dr. Blackwood's collection. Each one had brought misfortune to its new owner. The confession chair had driven its purchaser to madness within 6 months. The mourning locket had disappeared, along with the collector who bought it. Both were never seen again. The jade funeral mask had been returned to the museum within a week, after 3 staff members had been hospitalized with severe psychological trauma. The truth I learned from that terrible night is this: some objects become more than mere things. They become vessels for forces that exist beyond our understanding. Human obsession, human greed, human curiosity. These emotions can awaken things that should remain dormant. Marcus Aldrich thought he was seeking transcendence, but he was really seeking power, and in the end, he discovered that some prices are too terrible to pay, even for immortality. I kept a few fragments of the mirror, not out of morbid fascination, but as a reminder. Sometimes when the light hits them just right, I can still see faces moving in their depths. Faces that serve as a warning. Be careful what you collect, my friends. Sometimes the things we possess end up possessing us. And late at night, when the wind rattles the windows of my study, I sometimes hear whispers coming from those fragments, whispers that sound remarkably like Marcus Aldrich's voice, still calling out from whatever realm he now inhabits, still trying to complete his terrible ritual.